Hey guys, tonight we're travelling back to the oddly rainy streets of late 9th century Rome. You're standing in your sandals ankle deep in slushy mud that smells faintly of olives, sheep and political instability. Church bells toll in the distance, but they're not exactly calling people to worship, more like warning everyone that something ridiculous is about to happen again. Rome at this time is less eternal city and more eternal soap opera, except with more Latin and fewer coherent plot lines. This is the era of popes who rise and fall faster than poorly balanced stepladders. You blink and oops, there goes another pontiff, either poisoned, imprisoned, or just mysteriously retired to a monastery. If you're thinking about applying for the job, maybe don't. The average papal term is roughly the length of your last cold. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this sleepy little corner of history reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through Rome's winding alleys. Chickens dart across your path. A monk grumbles something about heresy as he adjusts a lopsided wheelbarrow. The city is crumbling in places, lavish in others, like someone stacked gold leaf on a pile of rotting firewood and called it blessed. You pass a crumbling statue that might once have been Jupiter, or maybe a very muscular apostle, and make your way toward the Lateran Palace, the beating heart of church politics and very dramatic decisions. This is a dangerous time to be important in Rome. The papacy is tossed back and forth between powerful Roman families, like a consecrated volleyball. Factions, clergy, nobles, and occasionally very opinionated milkmaids vie for influence. And through all this wobbly chaos, one man has just managed to secure the papal throne. His name is Pope Formosus. No one is sure whether to fear him, support him, or start carving his tombstone just in case. But for now, he's alive. Barely, and you're here to witness what comes before the infamous trial. Yes, that trial, where Formosus will one day be yanked out of his tomb and propped up like a ventriloquist dummy on trial for alleged crimes against church bureaucracy. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, Formosus is still breathing, still managing alliances, and still occasionally regretting that one time he may or may not have crowned the wrong king. The Carolingian Empire is splintering like a stale biscuit, and everyone wants Rome's blessing to glue it back together. Formosus is caught in the middle, like a priest trying to referee a food fight between emperors. His reward for trying a target on his back, and a starring role in one of history's weirdest episodes. It's 891 AD, and the sky above Rome has that grey, sullen quality that suggests a dramatic thunderstorm might roll in just to make someone's funeral more cinematic. You overhear a group of scholars muttering in Latin about omens. One says he saw a raven land on the basilica's dome. Another insists he found a fish with 2 heads near the Tiber. You try not to laugh, but superstition is no joke here. If your donkey sneezes on a Tuesday, that could be grounds for a neighbourhood exorcism. As Formosus takes office, you can sense the tension tightening. Everyone knows a storm is coming, but few suspect that it'll involve legal proceedings against a corpse. And fewer still would imagine that this moment, muddy, mundane, full of grumbling monks and half-cooked politics, would eventually spiral into one of the church's most famously bonkers chapters. Still for now, it's just another day in a city that's been conquered, sanctified, abandoned, and resurrected more times than anyone can count. Rome waits restless, and somewhere underground, a future defendant rests uneasily in his grave, unaware that his legal troubles are far from over. You're now trailing behind a weary-looking man in heavy robes, muttering to himself in Latin. This is Formosus, not quite pope yet, but already tangled deep in the snarled roots of ecclesiastical drama. His name, oddly enough, means handsome, though you'd be hard-pressed to say he lives up to it. His beard is impressive, sure, but his eyes dart like someone who hasn't slept since Charlemagne's third cousin stopped writing angry letters. Before he's the subject of the most infamous posthumous trial in church history, Formosus is just a bishop with big ambitions and slightly too many political enemies. You stick close to him as he travels because, yes, he travels a lot. As Bishop of Porto, he's been sent all over Bulgaria, France, even the Frankish court. Some say he's brilliant, a master of diplomacy. Others say he's that guy who just won't stop meddling in royal affairs. Let's pause and look at one of those trips. In 866, Pope Nicholas V sends Formosus to Bulgaria to sort out a religious dispute. Seems straightforward, except the Bulgarians get very attached to him and request he become their archbishop. Awkward. This upsets Rome because apparently Formosus never asked for permission to be everyone's favourite foreign bishop. Oops. Historians still argue whether Formosus was sincerely trying to spread orthodoxy or quietly building his own power base. Either way, it doesn't go over well. He returns to Rome under a cloud of suspicion, and for a time gets excommunicated by Pope John VIII, who was not exactly handing out Best Bishop awards that year. Yes, Formosus is kicked out of the church. For a bishop, that's the spiritual equivalent of being told to clean out your locker and never come back. But in true papal plot twist fashion, the tide turns again. John VIII dies, under possibly mysterious circumstances. Let's just say blunt force trauma may have been involved and the next pope lifts the excommunication. Formosus is back, baby. Not exactly beloved, but restored. And Rome being Rome forgets its grudges faster than a monk forgets his fasting vows when someone mentions cheese. By 891, Formosus is elected pope. It's one of those moments where everyone holds their breath, wondering if he'll finally play it safe. Spoiler, he doesn't. He's got too many ideas, too many alliances, and too many people watching him closely. You follow him into dusty meetings, through torchlit basilicas, and into awkward conversations with Holy Roman Emperor Guy No. 14, technically Lambert of Spoleto, but you'd be forgiven for forgetting that name 5 minutes later. See, Formosus tries to walk a tightrope between two powerful dynasties, the Spoleto family and the Carolingians. This is like trying to balance a bowl of soup on your head while juggling flaming scrolls. No matter what he does, one side is going to think he's playing favourites. When he crowns Arnulf of Carinthia as emperor, instead of supporting Lambert, who technically already has the job, he steps directly into a political bear trap. Rome naturally begins to grumble. You hear it in market stalls and monastery cloisters. Formosus is stirring the pot again. One scribe claims he saw a goat walk backward into the forum, a bad omen apparently. Another accuses Formosus of breaking canon law by switching bishoprics, which he arguably did. These may sound like petty complaints, but in a city where theology, politics and superstition blur into one chaotic stew, even a goat's behaviour counts as courtroom evidence. Through it all, you stick close. You see Formosus writing letters massaging egos, and probably second-guessing every single decision he's made since becoming pope. The man is trying to steady a rocking ship while someone keeps drilling holes in the hull. But despite everything he carries on, he holds masses. He blesses pilgrims. He tries to ignore the whispers, the threats, and the deeply weird dreams where someone keeps calling him to court, even after death. Because that's the other thing no one talks about yet. Rome has a very long memory and a very short fuse. Every decision Formosus makes, now every alliance, every letter, every crown placed on an imperial head is being carefully recorded. Not just by scribes, but by enemies, and those enemies are playing the long game. For now, though, the city settles into an uneasy calm. Pilgrims come and go. The basilicas echo with Gregorian chants, and murmured confessions. Formosa's still Pope walks the marble halls in slippers too big for comfort and tries to outrun the shadow of his past. He doesn't know that one day his own rotting body will be dragged from the grave to face a court that smells like incense and mildew. You do. And that knowledge makes each moment feel oddly haunted. So you follow him step by anxious step, knowing this story doesn't end with a eulogy. It ends with a subpoena. You're back in Rome, and the wind smells like rust and incense. Things have taken a turn, no blood not yet, but you can feel the empire flexing its brittle bones. The Carolingian world, once the glittering dream of Charlemagne, is now more like a jigsaw puzzle someone dropped in a puddle. Shattered crowns rival claimants and bishops who double as political chess pieces. And in the middle of all that sits you, and of course our reluctant protagonist Pope Formosus. You spend most days listening. Eavesdropping is practically a survival skill in this city. Gossip flows like wine at a bishop's banquet, and everyone seems to know something they definitely weren't supposed to hear. You hear Lambert of Spoleto's name, mentioned in sharp tones. He's the emperor in theory, a child raised to rule with his mother, Queen Agiltrude, whispering poison into his ear. On the other side is Arnulf of Carinthia, tough as a boiled boot, and eager to grab the imperial title by the beard. Formosus is caught between them. He's crowned Lambert once, a compromise, a gesture, to keep the Spoletans calm. But then, in an impressive feat of papal whiplash, he switches sides. Again. He invites Arnulf to march on Rome and retake the imperial crown. And Arnulf, being a man who sees diplomacy as something you do after you've trampled the enemy's vineyards, happily obliges. You stand in the shadows as Arnulf's army enters Rome, mud-streaked, grim-faced and incredibly loud. The coronation is hasty, gold incense Latin chants. Formosus places the crown on Arnulf's head and tries not to think about how many people are going to want him dead for this, especially Queen Agiltrude. If looks could excommunicate, her glare would send the Pope directly to eternal limbo. Here's a fun fringe fact. At one point during Arnulf's campaign, his army reportedly needed divine permission to cross the Alps, so someone held mass on the snow. It worked, probably. Or maybe it was just good weather. Historians still argue whether Arnulf was truly welcomed by the people of Rome, or if they just feared being trampled by war horses. Either way, Formosus saw him as the empire's best hope. But it doesn't last. Arnulf gets sick. Some say stroke, others whisper poison. There's always a poison theory, isn't there? He retreats, barely able to lift a sword, and Formosus is left behind with a very awkward situation. Rome is still technically under Lambert's thumb, and Formosus has just publicly betrayed him. Again. You start noticing subtle changes in the atmosphere. The guards at the Lateran look twitchier. The scroll carriers don't smile as much. Even the pigeons seem to coo more aggressively. Formosus grows thinner. His robes seem too heavy for him now, like he's shrinking beneath the weight of choices made under pressure, crowned in regret. In 896, Formosus dies. No lightning strike, no ceremonial flames, just a quiet, exhausted end. You're there, sort of watching priests whisper prayers over his body, already whispering louder rumours behind their hands. He was too political, one mutters. Too ambitious. Another shrugs and mutters. At least he's quiet now. His body is wrapped in linen, kissed by candlelight, and placed in a marble tomb near the Lateran Basilica. By all accounts, his papal chapter is closed. You might expect the story to gently fade from memory. That's how most papacies end. A little tension, a few disputes, and then silence. But not this one, because in death, Formosus is about to become much louder than he ever was in life. You walk away from the funeral feeling unsettled. Not because of the death popes come and go, but because of the expressions on the faces of certain cardinals. Calculating, cold, almost excited. There's talk of a new pope, Stephen VI, a man with a temper like vinegar in a silver cup. Rumours swirl already that Stephen hated Formosus, that he blamed him for everything from bad coronations to imperial embarrassment to a mysterious swelling behind his left ear. You think it's over, but the real absurdity hasn't even begun. The funeral is barely over, and Rome has already moved on, or at least pretended to. Mourning isn't exactly the city's strong suit grudges are, and that brings us to the simmering pot of vinegar and paranoia that is Pope Stephen VI. You first see him pacing across the Lateran floor robes, billowing behind him like a dramatic villain in a morality play. He mutters to himself a lot, though you can't make out whether he's quoting scripture or planning revenge. Stephen is elected pope in the months after Formosus' death, and something about the whole thing smells off. Maybe it's the fact that he's a former ally of the Spolitans, remember Lambert, the boy emperor Formosus essentially ghosted in favour of Arnulf. Yeah, that family isn't exactly in a forgiving mood. Now that Arnulf is out of the picture, slumped somewhere in Bavaria, with one eye twitching and half a throne, the Spolitans are back in charge. And Stephen is their man. You overhear the whisper first from a red-faced deacon polishing candlesticks too aggressively. He wants to put Formosus on trial. You chuckle. A bad joke, surely. Formosus is dead, and buried, and mostly decomposed. But the deacon isn't joking. And soon, no one else is either. Stephen starts making moves. Subtle at first questioning Formosus' decisions, annulling a few ordinations, getting very twitchy around documents with the dead Pope's seal. And then one day you see it with your own eyes, guards being ordered to the tomb. Not to pray, not to mourn, but to dig. This is the part where most people would back out of the story slowly and return to their sheep herding or scroll copying. Not you. You follow the guards through narrow corridors and down into the cold stone crypts beneath the basilica. The air smells of damp marble and dust, and something else, faint, earthy, unsettling. The scent of bad ideas. The tomb is opened with a scraping crack that echoes like a bad omen. And there he is, Pope Formosus, or what's left of him. Now here's where you might expect me to spare you the details, but let's be real, you're already here. The body has been underground for 9 months, not embalmed, not sealed in anything especially protective, just linen, stone and time. He's partially mummified, partially not. A sunken parody of authority robes, still clinging to Bones' jaw slack, as if mid-protest. One guard vomits quietly behind a pillar. Another crosses himself so hard he nearly topples over. The corpse is lifted wrapped, and yes, I'm not making this up, dressed in papal vestments. They put the robes back on. They even fix a crown on his head. If you've ever wondered what happens when reverence and revenge share a room, this is it. Historians still debate whether Stephen's motivations were purely political, securing Spolitan power, or more personal. Some whisper that Stephen genuinely hated Formosus, saw him as a usurper, a fraud, someone who broke canon law and ruined the church. Others argue Stephen was manipulated, pushed by Lambert's faction to stage a final humiliation. Either way, the result is the same. The stage is set for a courtroom spectacle no medieval soap opera would dare to write. The cadaver synod is coming. You walk away from the crypt mind spinning. Somewhere above you, bells toll for evening prayers, but the city doesn't feel holy tonight. It feels like it's holding its breath. Like Rome itself knows that something unholy, ridiculous, and irreversible is about to take place. And you're going to have a front row seat. The morning of the cadaver synod arrives like a fever dream. The sun barely peeks over the terracotta rooftops, casting long shadows over cobbled streets slick with dew and drama. You walk with the crowd toward the Lateran Basilica, shuffled along by murmurs, robes, and the sound of sandals scraping against ancient stone. No one's quite sure what they're about to see. And that uncertainty makes it worse. Inside the air is thick part incense, part mildew, part raw disbelief. Priests take their places, brows furrowed, not with holiness, but confusion. The bishops don't speak much. A few avert their eyes. Some glare openly at Pope Stephen VI, and one looks like he might burst out laughing if he weren't so terrified. At the front of the court sits Stephen himself. He looks pale, but determined, like a man who's just committed to the worst haircut of his life and refuses to admit regret. And beside him, oh yes, is the star of today's spectacle, the corpse of Pope Formosus. He's propped up on a throne, dressed in full papal regalia, mitre ring vestments, all the trappings of power, or what remains of them. His fingers are shriveled, the ring dangling loosely. His face is gaunt and sunken, as though scandal itself had gnawed it hollow. His body is kept upright with help from a deacon assigned to speak on his behalf. Yes, you heard that right. A deacon is appointed to defend the corpse. Imagine standing beside a decomposing pope, trying to mount a legal case, while the man next to you is literally falling apart. The deacon's expression suggests he's deeply regretting every career choice that brought him to this moment. His Latin is clear, but trembling. Stephen opens the trial with all the gravity of a man who doesn't realise this event will one day be mocked in 10 languages. He launches into a tirade of accusations against Formosus, that he usurped the papacy, that he committed perjury, that he was ambitious beyond the bounds of holiness. Some of these charges go back to that whole Bulgaria incident, which, if you remember, Formosus technically resolved decades ago and was already punished for. You begin to realise this trial isn't really about law. It's about spectacle, about vengeance dressed in liturgical robes, and about a city trying to cauterise its papal wounds by digging up its own skeletons, literally. The bishops mostly stay silent. The crowd alternates between stunned silence and that awkward rustling sound of people who desperately want to ask, are we actually doing this, but are too afraid to raise their hands. Outside the basilica, word spreads like wildfire. They put the dead pope on trial. People whisper at wells and wine stalls. He looked judgy. One man claims the corpse blinked. Another swears he saw a pigeon land on the throne and take it as a divine sign. Mostly, though, people are just too stunned to speak. Here's a quirky detail. Some sources suggest that Formosus' body was missing a few fingers, by this point either removed during burial or posthumously snipped for relic purposes. Historians still argue whether those fingers were missing during the trial or chopped off later as part of the punishment. Regardless, they're definitely a topic of morbid curiosity for the crowd. You sit near the back trying to process it all. The absurdity, the anger, the quiet horror of it. Rome has seen blood betrayal and holy wars, but this is new. This is personal. Stephen's voice rises as he declares the verdict guilty. Of course, the court is a formality. The punishment, however, is very real. Formosus is stripped of his robes. His sacred garments are ripped away like symbols being exorcised. The papal ring is torn from his bony finger. And then comes the final blow. Everything he ever did as pope is declared null and void. Every ordination, every blessing, every holy act undone with the flick of a trembling hand. You feel a chill in the basilica, not from ghosts, but from knowing that death isn't the end of disgrace here. In Rome, even bones are political. Stephen looks satisfied, briefly, but the faces in the crowd are harder to read now. This wasn't justice, it was a vendetta. And vendettas don't end quietly in cities like this. The trial is over, but the story's just getting weirder. You linger outside the Lateran, watching as the sun creeps through the morning mist, turning the basilica's stone walls gold for a moment before slipping back into grey. People shuffle away in uneasy silence. Some cross themselves. Others whisper not prayers, but questions. What now? Well, now comes the part no one prepared for, because declaring a dead man guilty is one thing, but carrying out his sentence, that's another. You trail behind a small procession of guards. They've been ordered to dispose of the body. Formosus, once venerated by pilgrims and kissed by cardinals, is now nothing more than evidence. They lay him down and hack off 3 fingers from his right hand, the ones used for blessings the so-called digitus benedicans. The symbolism is grotesquely clear. Those fingers, those papal blessings are no longer valid. The guards hesitate after that, unsure what to do next. Burial seems inappropriate after all. They just undid his papacy. So they opt for the next best thing, tossing him into the Tiber. Yes, that's right. The once holy father of the church is now bobbing in a murky Roman river, his papal vestments long gone, his limbs drifting somewhere between tragic and absurd. You stand on the bridge and watch the ripples spread as the body disappears beneath the surface. The air smells of algae, wet stone, and something uncomfortably close to regret. Of course that should be the end of it, but this is Rome. According to local legends, and let's be clear, historians still argue whether this is literal truth or just a heavily embroidered fishtail. Formosus's body doesn't stay lost. One account claims he washed ashore, days later caught in a tangle of reeds, looking remarkably, well intact, too intact, supernaturally intact. Cue ominous murmurs and shaky fingers pointing at the heavens. Rome begins to buzz with whispers again, and you can't help but notice the public is no longer laughing. Some see the river's rejection of the body as divine protest. Others believe Formosus is a martyr, now persecuted by his enemies even in death. A few claim miracles occurred wherever his corpse passed, healed. Limbs glowing candles fish that formed crosses when fried. That last one might have been a hungry friar's dream, but still the story spreads. People begin lighting candles in secret. Old ladies mutter prayers under their breath, while pretending to buy figs. You watch a child drop a flower in the river for the Pope who came back. Rome is shifting, not with rage, but with something quieter, discomfort, embarrassment, even guilt. Meanwhile, inside the Vatican, things aren't going great for Stephen VI. He wanted to erase Formosus. Instead, he made him unforgettable. You sneak back into the Lateran and notice the bishops aren't speaking as much these days. One mutters about omens there was an eclipse, apparently. Another says he dreamed of Formosus, walking through the basilica, dripping wet and smiling. That bishop hasn't slept since. And Stephen, well, he's losing his grip. You hear him pacing at night, muttering prayers that sound more like apologies. His sermons turn sharp, desperate, even a little panicked. He insists he did the right thing, that justice was served, that the church must be pure. But Rome isn't buying it. The people are watching him now, the way you watch a cracked jug of wine, curious, concerned, and waiting for the spill. There's even talk of revolt. Not open rebellion, not yet, but you feel it building. One angry cardinal here, a couple of mutinous deacons there. Even the baker refuses to knead dough for the papal kitchens, claiming the flour turned sour after the synod. Probably just old grain. Or a good excuse to stir the pot. Either way, you sense what Stephen doesn't, his grip on power is beginning to rot faster than the body he condemned. The sun hangs low over Rome like a weary eye, and you find yourself back inside the Lateran Basilica. Not for a funeral, not for a feast, but for something that feels like theatre dipped in incense. The Cadaver Synod has officially begun. You slide into a seat near the back as the trial reopens, this time in full ceremonial form. The basilica, normally a place of echoing chants and sombre prayer, now hosts a courtroom scene so surreal it feels like satire, except no one's laughing. Formosus is back, of course. Or at least his body is. Propped on a throne like a marionette forgotten by time. His vestments are stiff-stained from the grave, his crown cockeyed and his jaw unhinged in a way that makes it look like he's halfway through telling a joke he forgot the punchline to. The deacon assigned to defend him stands at his side again, a pale, sweating man whose job today is essentially to argue with a corpse on behalf of church law. You watch Stephen VI stride in robes swishing with the kind of righteous fury usually reserved for really bad liturgical singing. He takes his seat, stares at the body of his predecessor, and begins the proceedings with a voice so sharp it could cut communion wafers. You catch snatches of the charges as they echo through the hall. That Formosus broke canon law by serving as bishop of 2 places at once, that he lied to the church, that he perjured himself when taking the papal office. It's all rather dry, bureaucratic infractions so obscure they sound like someone got mad over filing the wrong tax form. But Stephen delivers it all with the gravitas of a man announcing the end of days. Meanwhile, the deacon musters what defence he can, occasionally addressing the limp, slumping body beside him. The late Pope, he says at one point, voice cracking, maintained loyalty to the faith. There's a pause. One of Formosus's fingers detaches and hits the marble floor with a soft clack. No one breathes. This trial isn't really for justice, you know that. Everyone in the room knows that. It's theatre, punishment, a warning. But to whom Stephen's fury seems less focused on the corpse and more on the symbolism. Formosus is being judged not just for his life, but for the choices he made, especially in backing Arnulf of Carinthia over Lambert of Spoleto. That political betrayal still burns, and Stephen's turning the ashes into spectacle. The audience is a strange mix. Some are clearly there for the drama nobles in velvet, squinting skeptically, hands tucked into their sleeves. A few church officials look horrified, one muttering prayers under his breath the entire time. And then there are the locals, merchants, servants, curious passers-by who watch the trial like it's a festival gone sideways. There's no laughter, but the confusion is almost palpable. One elderly woman near you leans over and whispers, "If I wanted to see bones, I'd go to the catacombs." You nod politely and try to focus. And then, like a badly written tragedy, it gets worse. Formosus is found guilty. Of course. No surprise there. The court decrees that his papacy was invalid, his deeds annulled, and his memory defamed. But the ritual doesn't end there. Stephen orders the body stripped of all papal regalia again. If you're keeping track, that's twice now. The corpse is yanked from its throne, the robes torn from its frame, and the fingers, those poor, blessed fingers, snipped away in front of everyone. The room is silent, except for the distant drone of flies. You watch it all, and feel the surreal weight of it pressing in. This isn't justice, not really. It's rage, performance, maybe even madness. And Rome is watching too. It's watching its Pope humiliate his predecessor, watching holy spaces turned into courtrooms, watching itself become legend, not for sanctity but for absurdity. And still, Formosus says nothing. You blink slowly, still seated in the basilica, as the air grows thick with the must of damp stone, burnt wax and shame. It's difficult to tell what hour it is. Time feels stretched here, like a badly copied scroll. Before you lies the dismantled shell of Pope Formosus, now definitively unthroned. The ceremony has officially ended, but nobody's moving. No triumphant cheers, no murmured hymns, just awkward silence. Because the charges brought against Formosus, let's be honest, they're not exactly headline-worthy. Sure, canon law violations are technically a big deal in church circles, but to the average Roman baker-butcher, or bricklayer, it's all Greek. Or at least badly pronounced Latin. You hear it plainly now as people start to murmur and drift out of the basilica. The charges sounded like legal riddles. Accusations that Formosus accepted the papacy improperly despite being the bishop of another city, that he supposedly conspired with Charles the Bald, who'd been dead for years by the way, that he ambitiously desired the papal throne, as though every pope got the job by losing a game of musical chairs. One merchant mutters, so he got in trouble for having a resume, and you snort before covering your mouth with your sleeve. Can't laugh too loud. Some of the cardinals still think this is sacred business. Stephen Fix, however, is anything but amused. From his high seat, he gazes down as if daring the crowd to disagree with his judgment. His jaw is clenched. His fingers tap the armrest of his ornate chair in a rhythm that sounds suspiciously like they'll remember this. And they will. Just not the way he hopes. The punishment carried out in public view is grotesquely meticulous. You've already seen the papal robes torn off again. The 3 blessing fingers removed. The papal authority of Formosus symbolically shredded like a poorly reviewed gospel manuscript. But there's more. Stephen orders that all ordinations done by Formosus be declared invalid. That's dozens of bishops, priests and clerics suddenly told, sorry your holy orders were issued by a fraud corpse. Please report to spiritual HR. The effect is massive and confusing. Some of these men had served for years. One bishop reportedly fainted when told his entire ecclesiastical career had just been undone by an exhumation. This is where even the church elite begin to hesitate. You can see it in their eyes, the worry that if Formosus can be unpoped after death, who's next? The idea spreads like spilled ink. What if Stephen turns on them too? Rome is political. Always has been. But this sets a new precedent, the kind that keeps deacons up at night, nervously checking their tomb arrangements. Now here's a curious tidbit you overhear in the crowd. Someone claims Stephen had originally planned to burn the body after the trial. Others say he wanted it publicly dismembered and scattered outside the city walls. Neither happened, but the fact that such rumours even exist tells you just how far this farce has gone. Historians still argue whether Stephen truly believed in the sanctity of his own actions, or whether he was pushed by the Spolatans by fear, by pride, into making a spectacle that couldn't be walked back. Some even suggest he thought he was protecting the church's integrity, though you know there are less corpse-involving ways to do that. And all the while, Formosus sits silent, sagging now bones shifting under what's left of his skin, slumped like a deflated puppet, with no strings left to hold him upright. The deacon who defended him has long since slunk away. The throne has been stripped of its occupant. Only the echo remains, as if the walls themselves are asking, "What have we just done? You step outside." The light has changed softer, lower, filtered through clouds like an apology. People mill about uncertain what to say. It's not rage you see not yet. It's discomfort, disquiet. The realization that they've just watched their faith used as theatre, their rituals bent into weapons. And somewhere down the Tiber, a current stirs waiting. By now, Rome has digested the trial, though perhaps not in the way Pope Stephen VI intended. You walk through the forum and feel it in the air, heaviness, like everyone is carrying around a question they're too polite or too scared to ask out loud. Did we really just put a corpse on trial? And if so, why did we kind of go along with it? The reactions around the city range from stunned bewilderment to hushed mockery. You pass a blacksmith who pretends to give a sermon to his pile of scrap metal. "Speak, O rusty nail," he bellows, "defend thyself before the forge." His apprentice tries not to laugh and ends up burning his sleeve. Children dare each other to play cadaver court in alleyways. One sits on a barrel and declares his rat guilty of heresy. A little girl throws petals at a bucket and solemnly says, "It's the Pope." This isn't sacrilege, it's nervous energy spilling into comedy. It's how people cope with absurdity when prayer doesn't quite cover it. But not everyone is amused. Inside monasteries and noble halls, the whispers take on a sharper tone. Some clerics are openly unsettled. You overhear one bishop murmur, "If the dead aren't safe, who among us is?" A librarian nearby nods without looking up from his scroll, as if he'd just added trial-proof burial instructions to the margins of a psalm. It's worth noting here that not all of Rome was present at the synod. Many learned about it second-hand, and the accounts vary wildly. Some say the corpse stood on its own glowing faintly. Others say demons were seen dancing on the rafters. One wild tale insists the basilica wept blood. A bit theatrical. Perhaps, though not out of place for a city where pigeons are seen as potential omens. Still, the common mood is one of unease. The trial didn't restore order. It didn't clarify doctrine. It certainly didn't erase Formosus's memory. Quite the opposite, it immortalised him. You notice subtle signs of tension. Guards now carry their spears with both hands, not slung lazily over shoulders. Priests fumble their prayers distracted. One churchgoer asks if she should confess the sin of watching the trial. Her confessor hesitates and changes the subject. And yet, there's also curiosity. Some people are weirdly into it. You pass two merchants arguing whether a dead pope can legally testify. One has drawn a whole diagram about ecclesiastical authority post-mortem. Another group tries to reenact the trial using a wine cask and a mop. They call it Saint Mopmosus. It's funny until it's not. You stop by a bakery where a new treat is being sold, dead pope loaves. They're just hard bread with 3 fingers of crust broken off, but the symbolism not subtle. The baker insists it's satire, or reverence, or both. It sells out by noon, either way. Historians later point to this moment as a perfect example of medieval tension between sacred authority and public spectacle. But you're living it. You can hear it in the bells still tolling, like they're not sure if they're celebrating or mourning. You can smell it in the incense that clings to every wall, like regret. And Pope Stephen VI, he's doubling down. He delivers sermons condemning Formosus even now. Insists he was right to expose the corruption of his predecessor. He doesn't seem to realise the room is turning. Slowly. Like a heavy wheel beginning to roll the other way. You overhear a cardinal say he's talking to shadows now. You glance into the basilica and catch a glimpse of Stephen praying alone, loud, and possibly to someone who's no longer listening. Maybe never was. There's something fragile in the city now, like Rome has cracked a little and no one's quite sure how to glue it back together. You walk through the streets and see it in every unsure step, are people trying to decide whether to laugh to weep or to rise. If you thought the climax of this story was a corpse on trial, think again, because Rome has saved one more act, and it's even stranger. You now stand among the crowd as the city reacts to the verdict. Not just the guilty ruling everyone saw that coming, but the actual punishment. The sentence is like a slow-motion fall, bizarre, unnecessary, and somehow still gathering momentum. Formosus's corpse has already been stripped, disrobed, defrocked, and defingered. Yet Stephen VI, never one to leave subtlety alone, orders one final humiliation. The body is to be buried without honour, then dug up again, then thrown in the Tiber. You blink. Maybe you misheard. But no word spreads quickly, each retelling getting more exaggerated. Some say the river boiled when the corpse hit the water. Others claim the Tiber spat him out like a bad omen. The truth, probably less cinematic. But the symbolism, impossible to ignore. You follow the guards again, joining the ragtag procession of onlookers, skeptics, and weary clerics tasked with carrying out the sentence. The route winds from the Lateran toward the riverbanks. The streets are quiet, in that way only an ashamed city can be, like Rome is trying to muffle its own footsteps. At the Tiber the body is tossed in with no prayers, no rites, no ceremony, just a splash, a swirl, and silence. That should be the end. But as you may recall, Rome doesn't do the end. Not cleanly, not ever. In the days that follow, rumours erupt like weeds in a monastery garden. Someone swears they saw the corpse floating downstream, still wearing part of his cassock. Another insists a local fisherman pulled the body from the water, took it home and buried it in secret. There's talk that the corpse glowed in the moonlight, that it didn't decay, that it wept. Historians understandably roll their eyes at this part. The idea that the body miraculously returned is a fringe claim probably whispered into being by those desperate for a martyr. But still, historians still argue whether the body really was recovered from the Tiber. If it was someone hid it well. Back in the city, things begin to twist. Public opinion, already uncertain, starts to tip. The spectacle of the trial, once just disturbing, becomes grotesque in hindsight. Jokes give way to discomfort. Even Stephen's allies grow quiet. You witness it firsthand. A cardinal who once praised Stephen now skips papal processions. A bishop refuses to repeat the ruling against Formosus during Mass, claiming it feels spiritually incorrect. That's about as close to rebellion as churchmen get, until they don't. The crowd that once passively watched now buzzes with discontent. You hear it in the bakeries, the bathhouses, even in confession booths where people whisper fears not about their sins, but about his Stephen's. The man who put a corpse on trial is now viewed with suspicion, then discomfort, then outright fear. One day you return to the Lateran and find the guards gone. Not reassigned, vanished. Rumour has it they refuse to stand watch over a pope who talks to shadows. Another claims Stephen has been waking at night screaming about the Tiber. And then it happens. A mob rises. Not a torch and pitchfork crowd. This is Rome, after all there's protocol. The people supported quietly by bishops and nobles who've had enough rise up and depose Stephen VI. He's arrested, removed from office. Some sources claim he's imprisoned in a monastery, others say it's a dungeon. Either way, within months, he's dead. Strangled, according to most accounts. No trial, no ceremony, no throne. Just gone. And suddenly, the air in Rome shifts again. You breathe it in, lighter. The heavy rot of shame and incense replaced with a cautious breeze of change. The church, bruised and baffled, tries to move on. But no one forgets. Because this wasn't just a strange episode, it was a warning. A moment when justice became theatre, when the holy turned absurd. And Rome, ever watchful, remembers what happens when power pushes too far. Formosus, in a twisted way, has the last word. You stand once more near the Lateran Basilica, though it feels quieter now, emptier, in some strange moral sense. Pope Stephen VI is dead. The man who orchestrated a courtroom horror show starring a corpse is now himself buried without fanfare beneath stone and scandal, and yet the damage he caused still lingers like incense that never quite clears. Rome doesn't move quickly. It sulks, simmers, then awkwardly adjusts its vestments and carries on. But something is undeniably broken in the church's image, like a relic dropped and glued back together, never quite the same. Now, as you roam through the city, you begin to notice a different kind of trial unfolding, the rehabilitation of Pope Formosus. It begins in whispers. A bishop quietly includes Formosus' name in his personal prayers. A young monk, copying old papal decrees, hesitates before crossing out the ones signed by Formosus, then doesn't. Then more boldly, new clergy begin to push for a formal reversal. They argue rightly that annulling all of Formosus' ordinations would destabilise the entire church hierarchy. After all, if Bishop A was made bishop by Formosus, and Bishop A ordained Bishop B, is Bishop B even real? You pass through an abbey courtyard, and overhear a theological debate so heated it could boil holy water. Are we to believe a corpse's blessings are invalid? One monk cries, he was Pope. Another shouts, was the abbot murmurs, and then he wasn't, and then he was again. That's right, Formosus's status begins to seesaw wildly. The next pope, Romanus, briefly tries to maintain the anti-Formosus position, undoing Stephen's worst excesses, but still refusing to fully restore the dead man's legacy. Unfortunately for Romanus, his papacy lasts about as long as a bowl of warm goat's milk in the sun. He's removed possibly by force, definitely not by applause. Then comes Pope Theodore II. His reign 17 days. But those 17 days are enough. In that time, Theodore officially annuls the Cadaver Synod, declares Formosus's actions valid, has the mutilated body, if indeed it's the same one, recovered and reburied with honours. You attend the modest ceremony. It feels less like a funeral and more like an apology whispered to a ghost. Formosus is restored. Again. But wait, don't get too comfortable, because next up is Pope Sergius III. And he says, actually, yes, Sergius flips the verdict back. He affirms the Cadaver Synod was legitimate, declares Formosus an illegal pope, and reinstates the original condemnation. Historians still debate whether this move was theological political, or just personal spite, carried down like a nasty family heirloom. You at this point feel like you're watching a dead pope get spiritually tossed back and forth like a consecrated volleyball. First he's pope, then he's not. Then he's pope again, then sort of pope, but with an asterisk. Rome becomes obsessed with the idea of validity. What makes a pope legitimate? Is it election consecration, God's will, or just whoever has enough angry nobles behind him at the time? These questions float above mass like awkwardly timed incense. And the faithful, they're confused too. You see it in their eyes. Is my baptism real? Was my priest truly ordained? Is there such a thing as retroactive unblessing? It's the church equivalent of opening your fridge and wondering whether the milk is still holy. Still beneath all this chaos, something curious happens. The Cadaver Synod becomes a kind of unspoken cautionary tale. No one references it directly, not for a while. But it hangs there in sermons, in silences, in the careful way bishops start choosing their words. A reminder that authority once abused leaves deep shadows. You find yourself walking more slowly past the basilica now, less to admire the architecture, and more to sense the tremor left behind. A lesson maybe about what happens when revenge wears a mitre, and dead men are summoned not for prayer, but prosecution. You sit beneath a fig tree on the outskirts of Rome, sandals, dusty fingers, sticky from overripe fruit, and you can't help but marvel at how Formosus, the pope who died, was buried exhumed, tried mutilated, dunked and reburied. Somehow became a symbol. Not of sainthood exactly, not even of martyrdom in the traditional sense, but of the strange enduring tension between power and faith, image and memory. And what fascinates you now, as the sun flickers through the leaves, are the many interpretations this saga has gathered in the decades and centuries that follow. You begin to hear not just one story, but several. Some see Formosus as a tragic figure crushed between two imperial factions who used popes like chess pieces. Others argue he was no saint, that his political meddling and shifting allegiances created the mess that eventually swallowed him. And then there are those who insist the real villain wasn't Stephen or Formosus, but the system that allowed such absurdity to unfold in the first place. You walk back into the city, passing students hunched over scrolls in shadowy corners of monasteries. They're still debating it. One insists that the trial was divine justice, that Formosus had broken canon law and brought shame to the papacy. Another counters with an eye roll and a whispered he crowned the wrong emperor. And that's why he got river dunked. Let's be honest. And then there's the question no one can really answer. Why go to such extremes? Historians still argue whether Stephen VI was acting under pressure from political allies like Lambert of Spoleto, or whether he genuinely saw Formosus as a threat to church legitimacy, even post-mortem. Some suggest madness, others propaganda. A few even hint at spiritual paranoia, as if Stephen believed that the very idea of Formosus had to be scrubbed from history to preserve the purity of the papal office. Spoiler, it didn't work. You see evidence of that everywhere. Formosus's name appears again in church records. His decrees initially voided are quietly reintroduced. Even his burial site becomes a modest place of prayer. Not pilgrimage, perhaps, but remembrance. And then there's the folklore. Yes, the Cadaver Synod eventually migrates from dusty scrolls into the mouths of storytellers. In taverns and under archways you hear a version where Formosus's ghost returns to haunt Stephen. Another where the river itself curses the city for defiling the dead. There's even one tale where the 3 fingers of blessing once removed reappear, in a holy vision glowing of course, and float gently down the Tiber like a divine message in a bottle. Is any of this historically accurate? Of course not. But that's Rome. Here history and legend drink from the same cup and leave behind the same stains. You stroll through a newer chapel constructed years after the synod, and notice something curious in the stained glass. 3 fingers raised in blessing, subtle, almost hidden behind a haloed bishop. A silent acknowledgement, perhaps, or a quiet joke passed down by a rebellious artist. What remains undisputed is this: the Cadaver Synod becomes a cultural touchstone not just for church historians, but for writers, artists, even later reformers. It's held up as an example of the church's lowest moment, of how sacred power can be twisted into absurdity, of how vendettas don't end with death when authority still has breath to scream. You pause by the Tiber, listening to the water slip past in its endless hush. It looks normal now, almost peaceful. But it knows. The river remembers. Rome does too. Because this event, this trial of bones, left a mark, not in scripture, not in stone, but in the imagination. It forced future generations to ask uncomfortable questions about papal legitimacy power, and the thin, crumbling line between divine order and human ego. And somewhere deep beneath the basilica floors, beneath the frescoes and marble and layers of rewritten doctrine, that trial still lingers, quiet, absurd, unforgettable. You make your way down a narrow cloister hall as the bells toll softly in the distance, low steady and reflective. Years have passed since the Cadaver Synod, yet somehow it feels more alive now than it did the day it happened. Not because the events themselves have returned, but because arguments about them have never stopped echoing through church corridors and historical debate. You step into a small, musty library tucked behind a basilica, where monks pore over scrolls, not in silence, but with the restrained bickering of academics in wool. Stephen was mad. No Stephen was manipulated. Formosus caused his own downfall. You can't try a corpse. And yet he did. Historians still argue whether the Cadaver Synod was an isolated moment of chaos or a symptom of a broader, systemic rot. You start to notice how modern scholars try to frame it. Was it simply political theatre? A grotesque misstep in papal history? Or perhaps this one's for the dramatic types, a warning of what happens when the sacred becomes inseparable from ambition. As you page through a dusty volume, you realise there's no real consensus. Some scholars defend Stephen VI's logic, pointing out that canon law was technically broken by Formosus. Others scoff, arguing that nearly every pope had skirted rules in one way or another. One medieval chronicler rather cheekily wrote, "Let he who has never crowned the wrong emperor cast the first stone." You smile at that. Dark humour is timeless. But what fascinates you most now is how this bizarre one-off event shaped the way people talk about the papacy forever. The very fact that Formosus's name was repeatedly exhumed figuratively and literally suggests something deep was unsettled. Not just about one man's legacy, but about the institution itself. If popes can turn on each other this dramatically, what is the church but a very well-dressed arena? Even centuries later, when church reformers look back on the messier chapters of history, the Cadaver Synod is always high on the list. Protestant writers in particular absolutely loved it. Look at the absurdity found, they crowed. The rot goes all the way to the bones. Quite literally. Artists too took their turn. There are woodcuts showing Formosus propped on a throne, skin sagging, eyes hollow. A deacon beside him, nervously whispering, "Objection, Your Holiness." The image gets passed around like an inside joke history made with itself. A kind of holy meme 900 years before Twitter. And that's what the Cadaver Synod becomes in many ways shorthand for absurdity and power. You hear politicians centuries later reference it when describing rivals digging up old scandals. You read scholars comparing modern smear campaigns to the dragging of Formosus's corpse. The metaphor sticks. When you try to humiliate someone so thoroughly that even death doesn't save them, that's cadaver, synod-level petty. You walk through a modern exhibit one day, yes, they made one where Formosus's story is told with reverent absurdity. There's a replica of the trial chair, a scroll with the annulled ordinations listed like discontinued menu items, and a short audio recording of a deep, solemn voice reading the charges against him, followed by a very long pause and the sound of water splashing. The curator calls it interactive education. You call it weirdly perfect. It's hard not to wonder how Formosus himself would have reacted to all this. Would he have been horrified, vindicated? Would he have preferred a simple, quiet legacy? No rivers, no trials, no hacked-off fingers, probably. But history didn't let him have that. And yet his name remains. You see it in the footnotes, hear it in late-night lectures, find it engraved, sometimes mockingly, into chapel graffiti. Formosus became unforgettable, not because he ruled well or lived long, but because of how thoroughly he was dragged through the afterlife by someone else's fury. So you keep walking, past the basilica, past the crypt, past the copies of old letters now framed as cautionary tales, and you wonder what kind of story would have unfolded if Stephen had just let Formosus rest. By now, you've walked the length and breadth of this tale, muddy roads, echoing basilicas the chill of crypt stones underfoot, and it all keeps circling back to one improbable, grimly comic event: a dead pope put on trial, dressed up, shouted at, and thrown in a river. And yet what lingers in your mind isn't just the absurdity, it's the obsession. You begin to notice that people, historians, clergy, even students centuries later don't just study the Cadaver Synod, they return to it, like moths to firelight, or maybe like monks to mystery. You sit in on a university debate somewhere in the 13th century now. History has started to swirl around you like incense. The room is dark except for candlelight, and the energy is electric. One young scholar declares that Pope Stephen VI was a pioneer in ecclesiastical accountability. Another retorts, "By that logic, let's go dig up Peter and ask him to clarify Act's laughter, nervous but real." Because by now, the Cadaver Synod has become more than history. It's become myth, though, not the kind with dragons or heroes. It's a myth of bureaucracy gone mad, of divine authority wielded with petty fingers. And it stays relevant, not in spite of its ridiculousness, but because of it. You slip out of the debate and walk beneath a cloister arch past frescoes of saints and sinners. And you think about how every generation seems to find something new in the trial of Formosus. For the Church it was a reminder of fallibility, of spectacle, of the need for limits. For reformers it was fuel. Look what happens when power answers only to itself. For artists it became a Gothic curiosity. For skeptics, proof that even the sacred can be ridiculous. And for the tired late-night thinker looking to fall asleep to something quietly surreal, well, it became the ultimate bedtime story. Because what could be more sleep-inducing than a courtroom drama that features no shouting, no blood, no last-minute twist, just parchment Latin, a dead man, and an outcome everyone already knew. But even now, centuries on, there's one question that still doesn't go away. Why did this happen? Historians still argue whether it was pure political revenge or calculated symbolism. Was Stephen VI trying to discredit Formosa so thoroughly that no one would dare revive his policies or followers? Was he appeasing the Spolaton dynasty by showing loyalty through posthumous punishment? Or was he just unwell? Some modern scholars lean toward madness. Stephen VI's later behaviour suggests a man unravelling. Others say the entire church was spiralling. The 9th century wasn't exactly stable. Popes rose and fell like market stalls. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork quilt of ambition and betrayal, and the clergy were often more warlord than shepherd. Still, even in that context, the Cadaver Synod stands out. Not because it's the most brutal episode in church history, but because it's the most awkwardly unforgettable. You glance down at your hands and imagine being the deacon tasked with defending a corpse. What could he possibly have said? "Your holiness, my client pleads." Eternal silence. And yet, that silence speaks volumes. Because in the end, Formosus never said a word. And Stephen, who spoke volumes, was buried in disgrace. Rome carried on. The church endured. And the basilica, stone-faced and unamused, stood still through it all. But every now and then, someone would pause beside its walls, whisper a prayer, and remember the day when justice and theatre blurred so thoroughly even the dead weren't safe. So the next time you hear of a scandal, or a feud, or some grand gesture made too late, you might think of Formosus, of his fingers of that river of the trial that never should have been. And you'll smile, just a little, because history, as it turns out, has a very dry sense of humour. You wander once more through the heart of Rome, though this time the pace is slower, your footsteps softer, your thoughts quieter. The story is nearly done, but the city as always lingers. In the distance, bells toll no longer menacing, just part of the city's eternal rhythm. You stop outside the Lateran Basilica, the site of that strange courtroom, long since repurposed for less dramatic ceremonies. And yet the memory remains, not as a plaque. There's no commemorative statue of Pope Formosus, no dramatic mosaic of the Cadaver Synod inside the nave. But it lingers in whispers, in scrolls, in footnotes. And in your mind you begin to trace it all back one bizarre detail at a time. You remember the mud-slick streets of 9th century Rome, the bickering bishops, the fragile ambition of Formosus as he played peacemaker between empires. You remember the power vacuum, the pretender emperors, and the cold political game of spiritual musical chairs. And you remember Stephen VI, the man who turned a courtroom into a stage, who pointed at a corpse and shouted accusations with the intensity of someone hoping to convince not the audience but himself. You think of the trial with its surreal dignity and inevitable verdict, the strange spectacle of a pope on trial without breath to defend himself, the snipped fingers, the river's embrace, the long, long echoes. The church continued, of course. Rome always does. It absorbed the synod's embarrassment, like so many others, wrapped it in Latin, filed it in parchment, and moved forward. But there was a shift. Subtle but there. Future popes would be more cautious, less quick to air their vendettas in public, less inclined to exhume their predecessors for dramatic effect. The synod became a quiet boundary line in papal history. A caution, don't go that far again. You wander down to the Tiber. The river as always flows, calm now, like it's forgotten the pope it once received. Or maybe it remembers everything and just prefers not to talk about it. Above you a crow perches on an old pillar. It doesn't caw. It just watches. And you too are watching. You've seen the highs and lows of a church still figuring out its identity, its limits, its humanity. You've seen how far power will go to protect itself, and how easily dignity can be washed away. But you've also seen the ridiculousness. And somehow in that absurdity, there's something oddly comforting. Because if even the most sacred institutions can fumble this spectacularly, maybe there's room for a little grace when we do too. So now you lie back in your bed, the story drawing to a close, like a procession slipping away into dusk. The city quiets. The basilica once filled with anxious footsteps and whispered accusations now rests in shadow. The cobblestones grow cool beneath the hush of Roman twilight. The cadaver synod, for all its noise, is over. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts stretch like vines across time, soft and curious. Picture the river at night no longer a place of scandal, but a smooth current slipping past marble bridges, carrying nothing but moonlight. Whatever it meant, whatever lesson it was supposed to teach about revenge, about legacy, about the limits of absurdity, it now settles into your thoughts like dust on a windowsill. Quiet, gentle, undisturbed. You've walked through centuries tonight, through scroll-stacked chambers and echoing chapels, through politics, through pride, through a moment in history that defies belief and yet somehow really happened. Let that sink in. Let it soften your thinking. Let it remind you that even the strangest stories can cradle truth. The candles have burned low. The bells are done. The ghost of Formosa says, if he lingers at all, only does so out of habit. Not haunting, just remembering. And now, so do you. Hey guys, tonight we step delicately into a world of lace gloves, potpourri scented hallways, and an absolutely unreasonable number of ferns. You're entering the Victorian drawing room, a place where manners are stiff, corsets are stiffer, and that potted Boston fern in the corner. It might be the most dangerous thing in the house. It's the 18th, you're in a home belonging to a moderately respectable English family. Maybe your aunt lives here. Maybe you're just visiting nodding politely while someone explains why pineapple motifs are suddenly vulgar. Either way, you're careful not to lean on the fainting couch. Yes, it's a real thing, and even more careful not to back into one of the many leafy, slightly dusty ferns crowding the room, like botanical wallpaper. You won't survive long here, not with that slouch, and definitely not with those ungloved hands. But that's okay. You're not here to impress the lady of the house. You're here to observe, quietly, as this strange moment in history unfolds, when plants became fashion ferns, became status symbols, and the drawing room transformed into a leafy jungle waiting to ensnare the overly delicate. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is. I love knowing where these sleepy stories land in the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The parlour smells faintly of furniture polish and boiled milk. A heavy velvet curtain muffles the clatter of horse hooves outside. You tiptoe between ferns, perched precariously on marble pedestals, their fronds arching like they're ready to gossip. You wonder, is there any room in here for people? Technically, yes. But just barely. The Victorian home isn't built for comfort. It's built for performance. For status. For displaying one's taste, one's refinement, and one's very specific obsession with potted foliage. The family fern collection isn't just decoration, it's a statement. A visual cue that says, we are tasteful, educated, and know exactly how humid to keep the morning room. You brush past a maidenhair fern and nearly knock over a delicate side table. It wobbles dangerously, and a porcelain dog trembles near the edge. You freeze. So does the dog. disaster is narrowly avoided. In the corner, a young woman in a high-collared dress perches near a cluster of aspidistra plants. She fans herself absently, cheeks pale. You watch her sway ever so slightly, then sink gracefully onto the fainting couch with the expertise of someone who's done this before. Victorian women, you're told, faint often. It's expected. It's built into the schedule right after embroidery and before tepid tea. But the causes aren't just emotional novels or unexpected glances from eligible bachelors, it's everything. The fashion, the social rules, the absurd indoor humidity caused by all these ferns. The furniture knows this. That couch. It's not just decorative, it's structurally designed for collapse. With a sloped back and one raised arm, it cradles the semi-conscious lady like a polite wooden lifeguard. No one questions this. It's architecture by expectation. You walk slowly around the room. Everything has a texture, lace velvet polished mahogany. But what dominates is green. Ferns of every variety, soft fronds, jagged leaves, exotic shapes, with names like stag's horn and lady's tresses. They peer out from behind bookcases, spill over into doorways, occupy prime real estate beside windows. And there's a reason for this proliferation. Ferns are clean, they're moral. They represent order and natural beauty traits highly prized in a society terrified of disorder. They're also considered safe for mixed company, unlike flowers, which often had implications. A rose might imply passion, a lily purity, or worse, mourning. But ferns, just ferns, neutral, tasteful, safe, mostly. Because you see, while ferns were beloved, they were also a bit treacherous. Especially in homes where fashion trumped logic. Place too many on too many narrow tables, and you have a tripping hazard disguised as decor. Add a tightly laced corset, slippery shoes, and the overwhelming pressure to behave like a porcelain doll at all times, and suddenly fainting into a fern becomes a very real possibility. Somewhere in the room, a clock chimes once an elegant little sound that startles no one but signals a change. Afternoon tea approaches. Someone enters with a tray of undercooked biscuits and lemon water. The ferns remain silent, but vaguely judgmental. You lean back just slightly and feel a frond brush your neck. It's soft, damp, and strangely threatening. You inch forward again. This is your first real moment in a Victorian parlour, and already you understand here, you're never alone. Not really. The plants are watching. The couch is waiting. And at any moment, someone could faint, possibly into a begonia, but most likely, a fern. You step out into the hallway for air, only to find surprise more ferns. Lining the staircase, clinging to sideboards, peeking out from decorative alcoves, like leafy little spies. It's like the house is being slowly overtaken by a polite jungle, one polite frond at a time. This you soon realise is not a coincidence. You've wandered into the heart of fern fever, or as the Victorians called it, with their characteristic flair, pteridamania. That's right, a genuine botanical obsession. Not just among gardeners or botanists, but across all social classes. Everyone wanted a fern, or 12. It started in the 1830s and bloomed much like the ferns themselves well into the 80s. You walk through a modest townhouse and then through a manor house, and both have the same unmistakable sign: potted ferns in corners, fronds in ceramic urns, pressed fern leaves framed on the walls. Even lower income households, if they could manage it, would keep a small struggling specimen in a jar near the window. It was fashionable, it was virtuous, and it was everywhere. What's odd, of course, is that ferns aren't especially showy. They don't bloom. They don't burst with colour. They're just green, lush, complicated in shape, but humble in temperament. And yet to the Victorians, this was exactly the appeal. Ferns were quiet sophistication. Not gaudy like orchids, not common like daisies. They were timeless, ancient, mysterious. You trail behind a woman on Bond Street, her skirt rustling like a soft protest as she pauses at a shop window. Inside a display of fern-etched teacups, fern-patterned wallpaper, and a giant glass case housing a rare Jamaican tree fern, the shopkeeper bows slightly as you pass, clearly aware that fern lovers are high-value customers these days. At one point, you overhear two women debating whether the maidenhair fern is too delicate for indoor air. One insists hers died from an emotional draft. The other nods solemnly. No one laughs. You head out of the city and into the countryside, following a trail of amateur botanists along a muddy lane. They carry trowels, magnifying glasses, and wicker baskets lined with damp cloth. Their mission? To find wild ferns for pressing sketching, or if they're lucky, transplanting. The true enthusiast owns a fern album, carefully labelled in looping script, each page a museum of mossy fronds. This is where you learn just how deep the obsession runs. Entire books were written on fern identification, fern gardening, even fern arranging. Societies sprang up for collecting and trading specimens. There were exhibitions, lectures, monthly fern-themed newsletters. Fern spotting became the respectable cousin of butterfly chasing. And the Victorians weren't only interested in native British ferns, they imported them from everywhere. Australia, the Americas, the tropics. If it had fronds, they wanted it. Never mind if it belonged in a rainforest, and their drawing room barely had a window. They'd try anyway. You pass through a greenhouse, glass panes fogged with condensation, warm with a subtle scent of damp soil. Inside, a gardener adjusts a pipe to increase the humidity. He's trying to mimic the conditions of a Peruvian hillside, so a particularly finicky fern won't throw a leafy tantrum and die overnight. Historians still argue whether this fern craze was about science fashion or something else entirely. A quiet rebellion, perhaps a way for people, especially women, to claim a bit of natural power in a highly artificial world. After all, while men held dominion over cities and politics, women held dominion over the parlour, and the parlour was where the ferns lived. But regardless of the reason, the result is clear. Britain is in the grip of a soft, leafy mania. You pause at a small fernery tucked behind a rural manor. The entire space is built like a shrine. Cool stone paths wind through potted plants arranged with precision. A trickling fountain gurgles in the background. Benches offer quiet contemplation. It's a sacred space. Not for worship, but for wonder. You sit on one of the benches surrounded by shades of green. The rustling of fronds is barely audible, but constant. It's peaceful, unthreatening. Unless, of course, you're in a corset. But we'll get to that. For now, you lean back and try to picture what it must have felt like to live in a world where ferns weren't just plants. They were the centrepiece of cultural conversation. Where you might attend a dinner party and be expected to weigh in on Polypodium Vulgare like you would a new opera. Where your parlour's aesthetic was judged not just by its piano or its porcelain, but by the health and vibrancy of your pteridophytes. It's lovely. It's odd. And it's just the beginning. You're back inside now, standing in front of a polished cabinet filled with fern books. Yes, fern books. Leather-bound, gold-embossed, heavy with enthusiasm and scientific Latin. You gently open one and see pressed fronds labelled with tiny inked handwriting. So delicate it looks like it might faint itself. Beneath one leaf, someone has written, Asplenium trichomanes, gathered near Tintagel, June of 58, a very moist morning. It's clear to appreciate fern fever properly, you need to understand the ferns themselves. So you crouch by a potted specimen near the window and really look. The leaves, technically fronds, are intricate, feathery, Symmetrical in a way that feels planned, almost architectural. There's something quietly hypnotic about them, like nature doodling spirals in the margins of its own notes. Some are upright, like miniature trees. Others droop like they've just heard bad news. You lean closer. There's no flower, no fruit, no seeds. Just these fronds, and on the underside little dots or lines. You blink. Are those tiny bugs? No, those are spores. The reproductive magic of the fern. Ferns reproduce via spores, not seeds. They don't follow the expected rules of plant life. No visible pollination. No blossoms. Just dust-like packets of potential drifting invisibly through the air, landing wherever the environment is just right. Moist, shady, secretive. You can imagine how that scandalised the Victorian public. Historians still argue whether it was the mystery of the fern's reproduction or the lack of flowers that most intrigued people, but either way, the plant seemed to carry with it a quiet kind of seduction. Its reproductive process wasn't just unconventional, it was practically invisible. To the Victorian mind, that made it, well, suspicious. Some began to wonder if the fern might be a symbol of untamed femininity, or natural intelligence, or even hidden desire. Others saw it as a perfect metaphor for moral restraint, a beautiful thing that refused to flaunt itself. And that tension between mystery and morality only made people more obsessed. You stroll through a conservatory where a lady and her governess pore over a botanical guide. One points to a diagram of fern anatomy. "This is the rhizome," she says softly. "And here, the sorry." The other raises her eyebrows but says nothing. You'd think they were looking at smuggled romance novels. The language of ferns, while technically innocent, starts to echo other things. Veins, fronds, hidden spores. It's all just vague enough to draw attention, and not always the kind you want at tea. You pass a young man carefully sketching a fern in a notebook. His expression is scholarly, but there's a hint of intensity. Is it admiration, attraction, or just the quiet thrill of watching nature refuse to explain itself? And then you reach a shelf in the back of a private study. A small, forbidden volume tucked between prayer books and Greek tragedies. It's not labelled. You open it. Inside, detailed fern drawings. Yes, but also poetry. Slightly dreamy, slightly sensual odes to greenery, to shade to unfurling things. You close the book quickly. Someone once felt very deeply about ferns. Back outside, in a modest backyard garden, you notice something else. Not all ferns are exotic imports or rare specimens. Many are native, ordinary. They grow in ditches, walls, cracks in the pavement. They're everywhere if you know how to look. That too was part of the magic. You could be poor female rural and still collect ferns. You didn't need wealth or even a big garden. Just a keen eye, a damp patch of earth, and maybe a jam jar with a bit of moss. It's hard not to see why this appealed, especially to women. In an age where so many doors were closed, here was a hobby that invited curiosity, exploration, classification, a little independence. You could walk in the woods with a basket, call it science, and no one could object. But even in this gentle world of mossy rocks and magnifying lenses, the fern retained its sense of mystery. It didn't open up easily. Its life cycle wasn't fully understood until the late 1800s. Even now, there's something slightly unknowable about it. It feels like a plant with secrets. And in a culture obsessed with appearances, decorum, and clarity, the fern stood quietly in the corner, refusing to explain itself. You're back inside a Victorian sitting room, and immediately the humidity hits you like a shy but persistent ghost. The room is fragrant with a mix of lavender wood polish and the unmistakable earthiness of too many indoor plants trying their best to survive the London air. You take a careful step. There's a fern to your left, a fern behind your chair, and yes, one artfully wedged between the piano and the velvet settee. You're in the middle of a phenomenon, and it's not just about plants anymore, it's about decor. The Victorian aesthetic is deeply committed to looking tasteful, which apparently requires a minimum of 6 potted plants per room, 2 glass domes filled with dried moss, and at least 1 fern lurking in a ceramic pedestal planter shaped like a Grecian urn. You turn slowly, taking it all in. These aren't random houseplants. They're curated, carefully placed. There's a language of ferns you overhear someone whisper, and though they're likely making it up on the spot, it sounds believable enough in a room like this. And here's something even more fascinating. Furniture was designed around all of this. You walk over to what appears to be a divan, but upon closer inspection, it's a fainting couch. Yes, that was a thing. You rest your hand on its carved wooden frame and realise it's just tall enough to support the shoulders of someone gracefully collapsing sideways from emotional strain, lack of airflow, or a particularly moving fern arrangement. Victorian women fainted. A lot. It was in part performance, a delicate reaction to art poetry or social news. He said he might call on Thursday swoon, but more often it was simply a physiological reality. Tight corsets, poor ventilation, heavy gowns and layers of emotional repression do not a breathable lifestyle make. Which brings us to the ferns. Ferns like humidity. People in corsets do not. This creates a perfect storm of swooning and wilting, some botanical, some human. You sit carefully on a slipper chair, not a chair for slippers, but a low seat designed so women could sit while putting on their shoes without creasing their skirts. Everything here has a reason, and all of it tiptoes around the possibility of fainting. There are ottomans placed like cushions of honour beneath strategically placed ferns. Small tables with water carafes sit within arm's reach of nearly every seating option. In one corner there's a porcelain bell to summon smelling salts. And those ferns, they're not just eye candy, they're obstacles. They arch, droop, and extend. They create a soft green labyrinth that requires constant vigilance. Step too quickly and your skirts knock a pot over. Lean back too far and you're greeted by the gentle kiss of a frond to the temple. Sit down too fast, and it's entirely possible to end up with a lapful of Boston fern. Historians still argue whether the plant-to-fainting ratio in Victorian households was intentional or just an unfortunate result of over-enthusiastic decorating. But there's no denying that many parlour accidents involved greenery. One housekeeper's diary includes a note: Mrs. Wentworth fainted again, possibly fern-related. Repositioned aspidistra near window. Even the lighting plays a role. Gas lamps emit heat, ferns need indirect sunlight, and humans, especially ones laced into their skeletal limits, prefer neither. So you get a room with heavy curtains, filtered light, and a constant battle between what plants want and what people can actually endure. And yet people love it. Guests comment on the freshness, the natural beauty. A visitor might say the arrangement is almost tropical, which is a very high compliment when you're in a drawing room in Liverpool and it's drizzling outside. You can't help but admire the commitment. Every frond is dusted, every pot matched to its pedestal. Some homes even have fern cases, glass terrariums built specifically to display delicate species, complete with tiny water dishes and miniature landscape features. They look like doll houses for plants. You peer into one and see a fern growing from a carpet of moss beside a small ceramic frog and a paper label that says Adiantum capillus veneris. A child might be forgiven for thinking this is a shrine to a fairy. Honestly, they wouldn't be far off. There's something magical about it all in a slightly claustrophobic way. Like nature decided to move indoors and got very into upholstery. And at the centre of it, the Victorian woman perched like a pale queen among her fronds. graceful, poised, slightly short of breath, ready to faint but tastefully. You're standing in front of a full-length mirror, watching yourself inhale, or trying to. The corset has other ideas. With each breath your ribs whisper complaints, your spine mutters threats, and your lungs are left negotiating for space like tenants in a London boarding house. Now imagine doing this all day, dressed in multiple layers in a humid parlour, surrounded by potted plants, and one judgmental housemaid. Suddenly, fainting into a fern doesn't seem like melodrama, it seems like a survival tactic. Victorian corsets are often misunderstood. They're not always torturous, but when worn tightly as fashion and etiquette frequently demanded, they compress the torso, realign posture, and reduce lung capacity. You can stand, you can smile, but you cannot under any circumstances do so comfortably. Add a few emotional stressors, a hot summer day, or one unexpected compliment from a gentleman caller, and down you go. Fainting becomes a kind of punctuation in the life of a respectable woman. Not just a symptom, but a statement. I am overwhelmed. I am too refined for this. Sometimes it's performative. Sometimes it's very, very real. You pass by a dressmaker's shop where mannequins stand stiffly in lace and whalebone grace. Inside, a seamstress tightens a bodice over a pale blue gown. She pulls the laces, and you swear the dummy size. A 22-inch waist, she says proudly, fit for a bride or a baroness. You wince on behalf of both. A young woman nearby reads the Lady's Book of Etiquette and Manual of Politeness, which among other gems recommends never expressing strong emotion in public. Not rage, not joy, and certainly not exertion. Imagine living under emotional house arrest and physical restriction. Honestly, the plant-filled fainting couch is starting to look like a pretty sweet escape plan. You sit carefully beside a fern-draped writing desk and find a small embroidered cushion labelled scented salts. Lavender and camphor, designed to revive fainted ladies, or just offer a moment of clarity. You open it. Sharp. Medicinal. A Victorian reset button. And here's something fascinating. Some physicians of the era genuinely believed fainting was good for women. A kind of nervous pressure valve. Better to swoon than to scream, one wrote. Another theorised that fainting cleared the brain. A refresh. A reboot via collapse. Historians still argue whether Victorian medicine treated fainting as a condition to cure or a performance to manage. Many women were diagnosed with female hysteria, a wonderfully vague umbrella term that included everything from anxiety to boredom to, let's be honest, being trapped in a houseplant zoo while wearing a fabric cage. You stroll past a physician's practice. On the wall, an advertisement for a breath-expanding corset designed to allow for slightly more lung capacity. It's frilled, and it promises dignity without distress. Behind the counter, a stern nurse adjusts her own corset without blinking. What's remarkable is how common fainting was, and how little it disrupted daily life. People fainted at church, at dinner, during concerts. One woman fainted during an especially dramatic reading of Wuthering Heights. Another during the Queen's Jubilee. These were not emergencies, they were social events. Part of the rhythm. Like coughing politely or being offered tea. The ferns in this story aren't just scenery, they're soft landings. If you must fall, let it be into something green and fragrant. Ideally not a cactus, but a fern, that's fine, even desirable. One particular house in Bath reportedly moved their tallest ferns to corners near the piano in case of dramatic episodes. The servants were told to water them, dust them, and gently rotate them weekly for even distribution of light and fainting coverage. You're starting to understand. Ferns didn't just fill space, they filled a function. Visual tranquility, air humidity, emotional cushioning, aesthetic harmony with furniture and fabrics. and crucially a kind of leafy grace for when things got wobbly. You lean against a tall pedestal near the drawing room door. A delicate lady fern droops near your shoulder, brushing your neck like a polite reminder. It's not saying beware, it's saying, if you need a moment, I've got you. And in a world where women were told to hold everything in breath, opinion, appetite, a fern-lined room offered a rare moment of softness, of letting go. Even if that meant doing it mid-sentence with a thud. You step through a conservatory doorway and into a salon where the air smells of violets, pipe smoke, and the ever-present, earthy breath of ferns. Someone has played a nocturne on the piano and left the room abruptly, as though the melody itself was too scandalous to linger near. You're here now to observe a different kind of drama, one not played out on stages, but in how Victorians assigned meaning to objects. Especially plants, especially ferns, and especially women with a bit too much free time, a bit too much imagination, and nowhere near enough oxygen. Victorian morality was a complicated business, always dressed in crinoline and layered with contradiction. Women were encouraged to be delicate, yet useful, attractive but modest, learned, but not too clever. Into this impossible balancing act entered the fern, mysterious, ancient and quiet. Ferns, you soon notice, became deeply associated with femininity. You're sitting beside a trio of matrons in rustling skirts, and they're discussing their plant collections the way others might discuss their children or eligible sons. One sighs. My Dixonia antarctica caught a chill and dropped half her fronds. The others cluck sympathetically. The language of plants was not accidental. Ferns were assigned gendered traits: soft patient, sensitive to climate, beautiful but restrained, the perfect Victorian lady, but with spores instead of suitors. And yet, there's tension beneath the moss. You move through the room and see a fern embroidery sampler, a delicate design of ferns growing in a perfect circle. But look closer, and the stitching hides a coiled serpent. Is it a design flaw or a little rebellion stitched in secret? Historians still debate whether women used fern collecting as a subtle form of independence, or if it was just another expected domestic task prettied up with green. For many women, plant collecting was one of the few respectable reasons to go outdoors alone. Walking for health was suspect, but walking for a fern, socially acceptable, almost virtuous. In a small village, you pass through a group of women host a fern swap. They trade not just plants, but stories, clippings of gossip, even pressed poems on linen. One reads aloud from her fern journal, describing a shadowed rock crevice where she found the perfect frond. The description feels charged. Everyone nods. There's a small scandal at the edge of town. You hear a woman caught climbing a fence to reach a rare variety growing near an old chapel. The local paper describes her as unduly passionate about moss. She is fined 1 shilling and becomes a local legend. You begin to understand. Ferns became a canvas for social tension, between nature and decorum, between exploration and etiquette, between the natural order and the fact that ferns defied all of it. Take reproduction, for instance. Ferns don't flower, they don't seed, they just happen. From spores, tiny dust motes of life scattered into the damp, which quietly sprout when conditions align. No clear beginning, no obvious romance, just mystery and growth. It was all very unnerving to people who liked their biology with neat gender roles. This led to more than a few uncomfortable moments. Some botanical illustrations quietly omitted the spore structures. Others included them with a vaguely apologetic tone. One fern guide describes the reproductive process as a divine mystery best not examined before luncheon, and still women kept collecting, pressing, drawing, naming, studying. You lean over a young girl's shoulder as she sketches a fern in her journal. Her ink is steady, her gaze serious. She labels each part with care. You see no poetry in the margins, no serpents in the stitching. Just science. It's beautiful. And it's powerful. Because even within the constraints of expectation, these women claimed knowledge, territory, a connection to something older, wilder, and not entirely understood. They may not have been allowed to vote, or own property freely, or speak at public meetings, but they could name 30 varieties of native fern and quote from memory their ideal growing conditions. And somewhere in that quiet knowing, a kind of resistance curled itself around the spines of fronds. So next time you picture a Victorian lady swooning into a parlour fern, remember she might also be the most well-informed amateur botanist in the county, and she might have stitched something into a cushion that would make her vicar faint. You find yourself back in a garden, this one delicately chaotic, tucked behind a modest country manor. The gravel crunches gently beneath your feet as you walk a narrow path winding through unruly beds of foxglove and forget-me-nots. And ferns, of course. Always ferns. But now they're creeping into something you didn't expect flirtation. Yes, somehow, in the embroidered, tightly buttoned world of Victorian courtship ferns, became part of the conversation if you knew how to read it. You stop beneath a trellis where two young people are conveniently accidentally meeting near a particularly symmetrical dryopteris. Their hands brush while reaching for the same frond. A beat too long. A glance. Then polite retreat. You're watching a very quiet kind of seduction. No one is saying anything improper, but they're collecting ferns. Together. And that says a lot more than it should. In the 18s, botanical pursuits became one of the few acceptable shared hobbies between unmarried men and women. You couldn't go out dancing alone. You couldn't dine together unchaperoned. But you could hunt for ferns, with gloves, and guidebooks, and enough plausible deniability to keep Aunt Prudence from fainting into a hedge. The act of gifting a fern frond became loaded. A pressed frond lovingly arranged in a calling card was like a Victorian text message that read, "I'm thinking of you, and also I'm deeply into paleobotany." You find a book tucked on a shaded bench, The Language of Flowers. It's a little battered from being read too often, its spine creaking as you flip through. Roses mean love, daisies mean innocence, and ferns, sincerity, fascination, and depending on the species, secret bonds of affection. Historians still argue whether these meanings were widely understood or mostly the product of poetic exaggeration. But the result was real enough. Young people used plants to say what they couldn't in words. You peek through a conservatory window and spot a courting couple sipping tea beside a potted maidenhair. She's not looking at him, not directly, but she's slowly turning the pot so the healthiest frond faces him. A green gesture, shy and specific. Inside her album, if you were allowed to see it, you'd find a fern labelled from Fenton Park, 1879, with a delicate blot of ink in the corner where she rewrote his name 3 times. And it wasn't all subtle. In some cases, young men took to sending fern bouquets, which, let's be honest, is both adorably nerdy and potentially risky, especially if the recipient's father didn't share your views on horticulture. One preserved letter you stumble upon includes a fern clipping and the line, "Your fronds are ever on my mind." Terrible pun. Absolutely. But it worked. The letter ends with a wedding date. The garden becomes a stage. A very leafy one. You walk past arbours where gloves accidentally drop. Past benches where someone left a pressed frond in the crease of a shared book. Ferns aren't just background here, they're collaborators. And if you were very daring, very bold, you might lead someone to your private fernery. A secluded corner of your estate, or just a glass case in a quiet study where your rarest specimens lived. Inviting someone to see your ferns was, well, rather like inviting someone to your vinyl collection in the 70s. It meant something. Still propriety always hung in the air like lace curtains. One couldn't be too overt. A frond could fall. A cheek could flush, but everything had to be shaded by manners, by moss, by metaphor. You stand now at the edge of a small ravine, watching a girl kneel to pluck a fern from the stone. Her escort offers his hand to help her up. Their gloves brush. He doesn't let go right away. She doesn't object. In the silence, something ferns have always known real growth happens in the shade. So while society obsessed over etiquette and restraint, there was something quietly rebellious about using ferns to flirt. They offered an excuse for closeness, for letters, for dried keepsakes tucked into Bibles or glove boxes. And even now, in this sleepy green world, you can still feel the weight of it, that blend of botanical curiosity and unspoken feeling. A language older than Latin, as old perhaps as the ferns themselves. Now you step into a space unlike any you've seen before, a great glistening hothouse, all iron latticework, and fogged glass panes that rise overhead like the skeleton of a cathedral. The air is thick, warm. It clings to your skin and curls your hair slightly at the temples, whether you've powdered it or not. This is a Victorian fernery, but on a grand scale. Less parlour, more jungle fantasy. As you walk down the central path, lined with gravel, too tidy to be truly natural, you're struck by how strange it all feels. This is nature, yes, but curated to an almost theatrical degree. Welcome to the greenhouse, where ferns grew ladies fainted, and status bloomed like a particularly decorative frond. Glass houses or conservatories became the height of fashion in the mid to late 19th century. The Industrial Revolution gave wealthy Victorians a whole new set of tools, iron frameworks, steam heat, imported glass, and they used those tools not to build factories well, not just factories, but to create artificial Edens behind their homes. Places where tropical plants could thrive in cold England. Places where you could house your delicate Jamaican tree fern without having to book a steamer to Kingston. And the effect was stunning. You walk slowly past the central pool, which reflects hanging ferns, the glitter of mist on glass, and the occasional ghostly reflection of a passing housemaid. Everywhere are the sounds of soft, dripping, distant birdsong piped in from somewhere, and the odd creak of a fern-laden bench giving up beneath the weight of damp contemplation. It's beautiful, but also strangely claustrophobic. You see ladies walking here in pairs, moving carefully. There's always the risk of slipping on wet tile or brushing too close to a frond and getting a small splash of condensation right on the bodice. In a social world where even a stained glove could spark concern, these were high-stakes strolls. One woman leans on her companion breath, shallow. "I adore the humidity," she says faintly, "but my constitution." She doesn't finish. She sits gracefully on a stone bench, nestled between two Blechnum gibbon. You half expect the ferns to lean forward and fan her. And here's the thing, hothouses were also status symbols. To own one meant you had not only wealth, but taste. Cultivation, literally. And to maintain one required a staff of gardeners, sometimes a boiler man, and a great deal of coal. Historians still debate whether these spaces were truly about plant science, or just a new form of aristocratic flexing. Probably both. You watch as a gardener missprays a rare species, with the delicacy of someone handling royal crystal. He wears gloves, not for fashion, for protection. The oils on his hands might harm the plant. You note the irony that, in a society obsessed with purity, it's the plants that must be protected from the humans. And not all was peace in the hothouse. Though lush and serene, these spaces were occasionally the site of social tension. Class divisions were built right into the bricks. Visitors entered in lace and linen, gently exhaling admiration, while gardeners toiled behind the scenes, hauling watering cans and managing pests no debutante was allowed to acknowledge. You catch sight of a disagreement at the edge of the path. A young man from the household, frowning at a gardener over the placement of a particularly showy Cyathea caperi. It blocks the view, he mutters. Shift it 3 feet. The gardener pauses, lips tight. That plant took 3 years to coax into that spot. But he nods. Yes, sir. The beauty of the hothouse, like much in Victorian society, is built on labour, hidden behind glass. And then, of course, there's the sheer dampness of it all. People fainted here too. Not for fashion this time, but for real. The heat, the humidity, the exertion of pretending not to sweat while being slowly poached in lace, it was too much. One lady's diary you read says simply Wednesday. Tea in the glasshouse. Margaret collapsed near the staghorn. I pretended not to notice. The scones were good. You glance at a fern positioned next to a side table that seems too elegant to be real. It bears the faintest water stain, someone spilled tonic water during a faint. Evidence of a social moment gone sideways, and still they kept coming. Because for all its pitfalls, the greenhouse was intoxicating. A place of lush escape, a softened version of wilderness. A fantasy realm in which one could be simultaneously refined and surrounded by wildness, albeit wildness trimmed into ornamental shapes and watered on schedule. You walk to the back of the fernery, where the air is cooler, the mist a little thinner. Bench sits beneath a high arched window, and a maidenhair fern trembles slightly in a draught. You sit. You exhale. And as you watch the light filter through rows of green lace, you realise this wasn't just a garden. It was a dream. Costly curated and quietly impossible. You're seated now in a quiet, book-laden room, a sort of gentleman's study turned impromptu botany corner. It smells of pipe tobacco and fern fertiliser, a combination that shouldn't work but does. Shelves sag gently under the weight of volumes, like British ferns and their allies and the unseen garden. A study of spores. There's a half-empty teacup on the desk, and next to it a polished magnifying lens still warm from use. This is where things take a turn for the microscopic. You lean in and peer through the lens at a single fern frond. Underneath tiny brown bumps cluster in neat rows sporangia. These aren't just plant freckles. These are spore cases, each one holding dozens, sometimes hundreds of near-invisible reproductive specks. Victorian scientists and amateur enthusiasts were fascinated by this. Ferns reproduce without seeds, without flowers, without, well, anything visible. They produce spores which drift and land, and if the conditions are right, sprout into a gametophyte, which then somehow makes another fern, sort of. Eventually. Even today it's a weirdly complex process, but to a Victorian mind steeped in strict gender roles and flower-based metaphors, it was downright alarming. You flip through a fern guide and read an awkwardly worded section on reproduction. In time, a second plant shall emerge from the dust of the first, with no obvious father and no apparent mother. But lo, it shall be green, comforting. The more people studied it, the stranger it seemed. Botanists drew careful diagrams. Clergy grew uneasy. A few eccentric hobbyists even tried to observe the full reproductive cycle under glass, watching spores sprout into tiny heart-shaped gametophytes, which then performed a mysterious self-pollination ritual, usually with no human witnesses. It was like trying to document plant magic with a monocle and good intentions. Historians still argue whether this unease was genuine confusion or moral discomfort. Some Victorians, especially the more devout, struggled with the idea of a life cycle that didn't involve recognisable male and female parts. If there was no flower, no bee, no divine order of pairing, what was it? To complicate matters further, ferns had a long association with folklore and mystery. You recall stories whispered in country inns, fern seeds that make you invisible. Ferns blooming at midnight on Midsummer's Eve. Even Shakespeare hints at it. Ferns as symbols of secrecy and things hidden. So when Victorian scientists tried to reduce ferns to Latin labels and anatomical sketches, they ran into resistance not from the plants, but from the public imagination. People wanted ferns to remain mysterious, a little wild, a little unknowable. You flip to another page in the guidebook, and someone, likely the original owner, has scribbled in the margin, "God's secret plant" underlined twice. That tension between scientific inquiry and quiet awe never fully resolved. You wander back into a parlour where two ladies and a bespectacled gentleman are discussing fern propagation in hushed tones as though it's a secret society. One lady turns pink and covers her mouth when the man says "prophallus." It does sound vaguely improper, in fairness. You continue into a nursery where a governess reads a simplified botany book to a group of wide-eyed children. When she gets to the part about how ferns don't need seeds, one child gasps. Another whispers, "Is it magic?" The governess hesitates, then says gently, "No, it's science." But she doesn't sound entirely convinced, and neither are you, because even now, sitting in the filtered light beside a table of pressed specimens and embossed journals, the ferns retain their air of mischief. They grow in the cracks. They thrive where flowers fail. They follow rules, but not the ones you know, which, if you think about it, fits the Victorians perfectly. A society obsessed with control, quietly haunted by the untamable. So they labelled the fronds. They counted the spores. They built glass houses to watch the invisible unfold. But deep down, they knew you don't tame a fern. You just learn to live alongside its secrets. You find yourself walking along a cobbled lane in town, your boots tapping quietly beside the rhythmic rattle of a cart filled with what else ferns. This is no aristocrat's greenhouse or gently crumbling country manor. This is commerce. Welcome to the world where ferns no longer sit patiently in pots. They march proudly onto shelves, into catalogues, onto the pages of wallpaper samples and biscuit tins. Yes, you've reached fern capitalism. And it is thriving. The height of fern fever coincided quite conveniently with an explosion in consumer goods. Print technology had improved. Factories could mass-produce everything from soapboxes to silverware. And the public hungry for beauty, for symbolism, for something that said I am cultured, but also up to date. Enter the fern. You stop at a general store window. Behind the glass fern-printed parasols, fern-themed ceramic vases, greeting cards delicately etched with fern silhouettes. There's a box of tooth powder with an illustrated frond on the label claiming it will refresh the breath like a walk through Devonshire bracken. Probably not, but clever. Step inside and the theme continues. A tea service with green fronds curling around the rim. A tin of toffee with woodland secrets stamped across it in gold. Even a pair of slippers embroidered with ferns so realistically they look like they might grow roots through the soles. Fern imagery was on everything. And it wasn't limited to goods. It crept into advertisements too. You see one painted on the side of a brick wall, a robust gentleman holding a fern and a mug of stout. The caption, "For strength as ancient as the hills." A bit of a stretch. But you respect the effort. This kind of branding worked because ferns meant things to people. Purity, sincerity, timelessness. And unlike roses, which could be scandalous, or lilies, which might be too funereal, ferns were safe, elegant, a blank canvas with class appeal. Of course, not everyone could afford the real thing. So for those without access to greenhouses or polite swamplands, the fern came to them, in textiles in plaster, even in funerary design. You pause by a lace maker's stall and see a pattern called the widow's frond, designed for mourning veils. Quietly fashionable, acceptably sad. And yes, there were even fake ferns, silk replicas for households that lacked the right climate or perhaps the will to mist something every day. One catalogue from 1874 proudly offers lifelike artificial ferns for parlour or resting chamber, guaranteed not to wither in emotional climates. You walk past a print shop offering hand-coloured fern illustrations suitable for framing. The artist, you're told, has never seen a real fern, but works from reference sketches. You look closely and realise it doesn't matter. The idea of the fern has taken root. Even the railway stations aren't immune. You pass through one in Manchester and spot a fern etched into the tilework near the ticket counter. It's subtle but unmistakable. A nod to gentility amidst soot and steam. And here's a funny twist. The more ferns appeared on products, the more their original mystique began to dilute. What was once an ancient forest dweller, rich in folklore and mystery, was now printed on the side of a soap wrapper, beautiful still, but a little less sacred. Historians still argue whether fern imagery democratized taste, or simply commercialized it beyond recognition. Did it elevate the working classes, or dilute botanical wonder into decorative wallpaper? You peer into a bakery where pastries have been dusted with powdered sugar ferns using little stencils. They're lovely, sweet, completely edible. A sign on the counter reads, "Try our bracken buns, seasonal and stylish." And just like that, the fern, once the secret code of poets and passionate plant hunters, has become desserts. Still, you can't help but be impressed. Few plants have managed this level of cultural saturation. The daisy had a good run. The rose will always be dramatic. But the fern went viral before anyone had a word for it. You leave the shop and stroll down the street, your eyes catching ferns tucked into doorknocker designs, etched into window grills, painted in the corners of oil portraits. The Victorians didn't just love ferns, they branded them into the fabric of their everyday. And while the craze may have started in quiet parlour corners and damp conservatories, by now it's a full-blown trend. A movement. A leafy logo for an era that longed for nature, but wanted it curated potted, and preferably sold in matching sets of 6. You're stepping off a gravel path and into a city park, the kind funded by a wealthy benefactor who insisted on benches shaped like acorns and a fernery open to the public every Sunday after church. The air is crisp today, less humidity, more frost in the breeze, but the ferns are still here. Nestled in shady corners dusted with dew, some cradled in iron urns, others sprouting freely near mossy stones. And here at last you see how class shaped the fern craze. This is the democratized version, a communal patch of curated wilderness. Mothers with prams stroll past fern beds while chimney sweeps just off shift nap under a tree. A clerk on lunch break reads Pickwick papers while eating a ham sandwich, one bench over from a student sketching a Dryopteris affinis with serious intensity. The fern has gone public, but it wasn't always that way. When the fern craze first took off, only the upper and upper middle classes had access to greenhouses, imported specimens, or the spare time to develop the kind of obsessive knowledge necessary to casually drop Latin names into conversation. Everyone else mostly looked through the window, or read about ferns in serialised novels where they became symbolic of mystery longing and upper-class leisure. Yet slowly that began to change. You walk through a row of terraced houses where small windowsills host jam jars filled with soil water and, yes, ferns. Scrappy little ones clipped from ditches or crumbling brick walls. They're no tree fern from New South Wales, but they're green. They live. And they offer a kind of elegance to families who can't afford wallpaper, but want something beautiful to soften the smoke-stained sill. In one flat you notice a child's fern album pages, made from newspaper scraps bound with string and pressed with tiny fronds. Each is labelled in careful wonky handwriting. One reads, "Found near bridge behind grocers. Still alive 3 days." For the working class ferns became aspirational, and more than that possible. Unlike oil paintings or harpsichords, you could find a fern. You could press it, keep it, name it. You attend a local lecture at the Mechanics Institute, a place where working men gather to learn in the evenings. Tonight's topic, the reproductive mystery of ferns. The room is packed. Some came for the science, others for the novelty. All stay for the lantern slides. When the spores are magnified, there's a small gasp in the crowd. And here's the twist, many upper-class Victorians found this deeply unnerving. You read an editorial in a crumpled newspaper left on a tram seat. The writer laments the overexposure of ferns, claiming that the working man cannot appreciate their subtlety, and that no respectable lady wishes to see maidenhair reduced to doorstep decoration. Historians still debate whether this shift marked the beginning of the end for the fern craze. Did it become too common, too accessible, too unexclusive? But the plants didn't care. They sprouted in graveyards, in alleyways, in churchyards and cracks in the brick. Public parks installed rockeries full of ferns. Botanical gardens hosted free days. Some schools even added plant pressing to the curriculum. You step into a greenhouse attached to a small urban grammar school. Inside, children cluster around pots, misting and measuring and poking at moss. One child holds up a fern and says, "This one's name is Agatha." The teacher blinks but doesn't correct him. This access to nature changed people, quietly, slowly. The fern became a bridge between worlds, between rich and poor science, and feeling ownership and admiration. You sit down near a fountain in the centre of the park, where a fern leans precariously over the edge, catching drops like it's thirsty for spectacle. Around you, conversations drift by. One couple discusses weekend plans. A boy reads aloud from a botany manual. An old man smokes a pipe and hums a tune you almost recognise. And you realise something: the fern is still doing what it always did, offering peace, offering mystery, and now more than ever offering presence, a bit of beauty anyone can touch. The street you're on narrows into a quiet lane, cobbled and slightly crooked, like it's trying to remember being a deer path. A dressmaker's shop sits on the corner, the bell above the door tinkling softly as a customer leaves, holding a bonnet trimmed rather extravagantly with ferns. You follow her down the lane, watching as her green satin ribbons flutter like fiddleheads in the wind. Today you're diving into fern fashion. And yes, that is a real phrase. It began subtly as most Victorian trends did. A brooch here, a stitched frond there. But as fern mania grew, ferns slinked their way into textiles, accessories, and even undergarments. You pass a shop window with embroidered handkerchiefs that would make even a modest sneeze feel like an afternoon walk in Kew Gardens. A mannequin in the display wears a moss green dress with intricate black lace fern embroidery that runs from cuff to collar, tasteful if wildly impractical for walking past anything with a snaggy nail. Inside the shop, dressmakers are arguing gently over thread. Colour, is it more maidenhair or bracken? One asks, holding two spools up to the light. A young assistant in the back is sewing a panel of bodice lining with tiny pressed fern appliques. She squints. She sighs. She pricks her finger, but doesn't swear. She simply dabs the blood away with a fern-patterned rag. The commitment is real. Now you might think, why ferns? Why not roses or poppies? Well, roses were already everywhere, and they carried all kinds of emotional baggage. Too romantic, too tragic. But ferns were elegant, ancient, fashionable without being flirty. They whispered mystery without screaming scandal. Until they didn't. Because some designs began to lean bold. Not just decorative, but defiant. You find a battered catalogue tucked into a stack of sewing patterns, wild work patterns for the natural woman. The drawings show corsets with fern spines instead of whalebone dresses shaped like leafy spirals. Even a walking dress with sleeves meant to mimic unfurling fiddleheads. Some called it eccentric. Others called it proto-feminist. Historians still argue whether fern fashion gave women a quiet way to reclaim agency after all the fern was associated with secrecy, self-reproduction, and natural elegance. And a woman could wear that literally, on her wrist, in her hair, or around her waist where the corset pinched but the embroidery resisted. You enter a millinery where a row of bonnets hangs like puffy halos from hooks. Each features some kind of fern, hand-painted, feather-stitched or tucked in fresh, like a secret. One has a velvet band with a motto stitched beneath the brim, frond and free. You smile, subtle but sharp. Even children's clothes weren't spared. You spot a toddler in a pale smock with a giant stenciled fern on the back half decoration, half camouflage. She toddles straight into a shrubbery and briefly disappears. The fern has claimed her. There were even fern-themed morning dresses, charcoal grey silks edged in silver-threaded fronds, a tribute to nature's quiet persistence. Life renews, they seem to say, even in shadow. But the most surprising corner of fern fashion jewellery, you stop at a jeweller's case. Inside fern-shaped brooches made from jet, amber, ivory. A locket holds a pressed frond behind a bubble of glass. The note reads, "Found at his favourite path, September 1883. A relic, a memory, a fern wearing someone else's story." And for those with botanical obsession and artistic leanings, there was fern tattooing not common, but whispered about. Done with henna or coal ash. Always discreet. A small curl on the inner wrist. A hidden leaf behind the ear. You lean in and wonder how many still wore their ferns in secret, long after the craze had faded. Outside the dress shop, a group of suffragists marches by, not loudly, not today, but you notice one has a fern stitched into her sash. Green on white. A nod. A root. A reminder that fashion doesn't always scream. Sometimes it simply grows. And as you walk away, your eyes adjusting to the softer light at dusk, you realise something beautiful. The fern had bloomed not just in hothouses, but on fabric, skin and soles. A pattern made permanent. A statement in stitches. You're strolling now down a quieter avenue, one of those sleepy late Victorian streets where every window seems to wear a curtain of lace, and every garden gate creaks just enough to remind you it's been a long, damp year. But something feels different today. The energy's shifted. The lace is yellowing. The ferns in the windows look tired. You peer into a parlour and see it. A wallpaper pattern, and you recognise ferns of course, but it's peeling. The fern craze, once vibrant, has started to wilt. It didn't collapse overnight. No mass fern-burning parties in the square. No scandal that brought the fronds down in shame. But slowly, softly, the Victorian public began to look away. New patterns caught the eye. New fads took root. Where once you'd see fern-embroidered antimacassars and wall-mounted pressed frond art, now there's Japanese fans. Peacocks. A growing fascination with the Orient. Through a very filtered lens, of course. But here's the key: everything popular eventually becomes passé. And fern fever, like all frenzies, was doomed to cool. You walk past a used bookstore and glance at a crate marked Outdated Naturalism 3d. It's full of fern albums, some pages brittle, others stained. One cover bears a ribbon long since faded to beige. You flip through and find loving annotations. Found in Mother's Garden, July. From Edward, don't tell father. They still whisper. But no one's listening. And then there's the critics. You pick up a dusty copy of the Morning Review, 1896. The headline: Ferns, a faddish folly of the genteel classes. Oof! It goes on to call fern collecting a symptom of idle domestic fantasy and suggests respectable people turn their attention to real social issues like railway safety or wallpaper regulation. Historians still debate whether this was the result of changing tastes or a subtle societal shift. Some say people simply got bored. Others believe it was backlash against the femininity of fern culture, the accessibility it gave to lower classes, or the creeping suspicion that maybe, just maybe, the fern had never really meant anything at all. But you and I know better. The fern always meant something. Even if people forgot, even the shops change. You pass a dry goods store that once sold imported fern pots, it's now a photography studio. In the window, someone's posed in front of a painted backdrop of ferns. Ironic. The plant that once filled homes is now just scenery. And while a few diehards remained eccentric, collectors, elderly ladies with glass cloches full of damp specimens, most let their potted ferns die, or quietly gave them to housemaids. Some were replanted in public parks, where they thrived in the shade no longer fashionable, but still impossibly green. You pause near a conservatory that's seen better days. The panes are smudged. One is cracked. Inside, a single Boston fern remains. A sign reads, "Do not water staff only." It's still going, sort of. There's something bittersweet in this decline, because the fern hadn't changed. It still unfurled in quiet spirals, still caught raindrops like tiny emerald goblets, still whispered in the shade. But the gaze had moved. The spotlight shifted. Fashion had no use for what it once adored. You see an old woman walking slowly along the path, shawl around her shoulders, a pressed fern in a pendant at her neck. She doesn't look at you. She's looking at the park ferns, the real ones, the ones that don't care about trends. And in that moment you realise the fern didn't fade. It retreated, back to the woods, the corners, the cracks between bricks. It let the spotlight pass and kept growing anyway, quiet, green, enduring. The evening's drawing in now with a kind of soft quiet that feels earned, like the hush that follows a long dinner party when guests have gone and the candles burn lower. You find yourself wandering along the edge of a small rural churchyard. Ivy curls over the stone wall. A few forgotten graves tilt gently weather-worn, the inscriptions barely legible. But beside one half-shadowed, half-lit, by the last scraps of daylight, you spot a familiar silhouette. A fern. Of course. Here, away from parlours and pattern books, the fern endures. It's not painted or pressed, just growing. Between the stones. Along the path, tucked against the base of a headstone, like it's keeping vigil. And that's the strange beauty of it. The afterlife of the fern craze is not extinction. It's reversion. Back to shade. Back to mystery. Back to places where no one is measuring soil pH with a silver spoon or stitching fiddleheads into corsets. You walk toward the woods behind the church. There's no path exactly, but the bracken shows you where to go, arching back politely, parting like velvet theatre curtains. The deeper you go, the more it feels like the beginning of a myth. Not the clamour of Victorian enthusiasm, not the tea-sipping collecting parties. Something older, wilder, something whispered about before London even had cobblestones. The folklore rushes back to meet you. You remember ferns that bloom only on midsummer's night, seeds that if caught at the exact moment they appear, can grant invisibility. Spores said to whisper secrets if collected under a waxing moon. Nonsense probably, but the kind that smells better than truth. Historians still argue whether these stories were ever believed or simply enjoyed, but belief isn't always the point. Sometimes it's enough to lean toward magic and let it pass softly overhead like mist. You duck beneath a fallen tree and find a patch of ferns glowing faintly in the half-light. The shapes are unmistakable. Their symmetry feels intentional, as if placed there, as if arranged by something that doesn't need to explain itself. And standing in that damp stillness, you understand why the Victorians were enchanted. Because even now, stripped of all ornament, the fern still enchants. Its leaves curl and shimmer like slow-motion fireworks. It doesn't need petals or fragrance or flair. It exists in quiet defiance of flashier flora. It's the introvert of the plant world content to observe unfurl and photosynthesize in peace. And maybe that's the legacy. Not the printed pillowcases or the botanical treatises. Not the teaspoons or terrace gardens, but the reminder that some beauty doesn't need attention to thrive. That some fascination doesn't need conclusion. That not everything mysterious is meant to be explained. You sit for a moment in the soft mulch, the scent of moss thick in your nose. A breeze rustles the canopy above. Something small scampers away unseen. And you exhale deeply. You've been walking through decades of obsession art, science, silliness and soil. And here at last is silence. You place your hand on the cool ground beside one low fern. Its fronds twitch slightly. Not fearfully, just acknowledgement. And you imagine for one sleepy moment that it recognizes you too. The fern returns to the forest. And you perhaps return to yourself. The forest begins to thin ever so slightly. And as you walk, the shadows stretch longer, gentler, like fingers coaxing you toward the edges of sleep. The soft hush of leaves gives way to the faint sound of your own footsteps, moss-muted and dreamlike. Ahead, you spot a wooden bench nestled beside a low stone wall. You sit, not because you're tired, but because it feels like the right thing to do at this point in the story. You've reached the final twist of this fern-filled tale legacy. Because even after the fashions faded, the fads quieted, and the collectors boxed up their albums, the fern didn't vanish from culture. It just evolved. Like a clever spore floating quietly through time, finding strange new places to land. You glance at the watch on your wrist. Not a Victorian heirloom, but modern. Still somewhere in a museum, or maybe in someone's great aunt's drawer, there's a fern-stamped brooch. A silver hairpin, a locket holding a faded frond and a tiny photo. Keepsakes from a leafy obsession. You think back to the fern album in that dusty bookshop with its fragile annotations and pressed memories. Today those albums are collector's items, but they also live on in new ways. A vintage Etsy shop, a university herbarium, even in tattoo designs shared online looping across collarbones or hidden behind ears. The fern persists. And while it's no longer sewn into crinolines or brewed into dubious teas, it's still with us in backyard shade gardens, terrariums on office desks, Instagram posts tagged #plantparenthood, and yes, whispered about in bedtime YouTube stories. Like this one. And here's the oddest twist of all. The Victorian fern craze might have shaped the way we think about nature today. Back then, ferns brought a bit of wildness into domestic life. Now we bring houseplants into tiny apartments for the same reason, to soften the world, to feel something green, to breathe. Historians still argue whether the fern craze was truly about botany, or just a safe way for people, especially women, to explore independence, curiosity and quiet rebellion within socially acceptable bounds. But you, sitting here among shadows and leaf litter, you suspect it was both. You look down and beside your boot, a fresh fiddlehead curls small and bright, ready to unfold. A new beginning. So the next time you see a fern on a garden walk or a tea towel, remember you're not just looking at a plant. You're looking at a remnant of Victorian yearning, of scientific delight, of gentle obsession. You're seeing a little echo from an age that couldn't quite explain the fern, and maybe didn't need to. Because some things, like sleep, like love, like fronds unfolding in moonlight, are better felt than fully understood. Let's slow everything now. You're still sitting on that wooden bench, the night deepening around you, the forest quiet. Except for the occasional rustle wind, not worry. You take one more breath in slow and full, and let it drift back out like mist, curling off the top of a quiet river. Above the sky has softened into velvet blue, dotted with stars just beginning to blink into focus. You trace a few constellations, though their names slip from memory. It doesn't matter. You're not here to catalogue, just to be. The fern beside you rests too unmoving now, as if lulled into stillness by the hush of your presence. You reach down gently, brush its edge with your fingertips. Cool, feathery, patient. You think of everything you've wandered through tonight, greenhouses and graveyards, corsets and conservatories, whispering botanists and overworked governesses. You've walked through parlours full of lace, and into woods full of wonder, and now you've come to rest. Let the weight of the story settle into you like a soft blanket. Let the names and years blur. Let the curiosity fade into comfort. There's no more to learn tonight, nothing more to chase. Only stillness, only sleep. So close your eyes if they're not already closed. Let your breath deepen, your muscles go slack, your thoughts scatter like spores in the breeze. You're safe here, you're home, and the fern quiet as ever will keep watch.